This is Dateline News and Conversation. The topics tonight: how the United States military-industrial complex has used think tanks to hijack EU policymaking. We're also going to talk about a new book that's coming out later this year, the think tank Racket-Managing the Infowars with Russia. And finally, we're going to talk about the United States' use of soft power around the world. My guest has been here many times before. He's a professor at South Eastern Norway University. He's been employed by the Moscow Higher School of Economics. He's a regular contributor to RT, and he's an expert at the Valdai Discussion Club. He's often described in the media and by some of his colleagues as a Russian propagandist. I'm very happy to welcome back to the show Professor Glenn Diesen. Glenn, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back on, Regis.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and everybody loves you. They love your commentary. You are extremely bright, intelligent, and well-informed, and I think one of the foremost experts on Russia foreign policy, and Russian history. So tonight, I want to begin with the title of an article you just penned for RT. It was how the United States military-industrial complex has used think tanks to hijack EU policy making. Now, when and why did you decide to write this article?
Well, the article is based on a book which I wrote on the same topic, because usually when you address power, it's common to divide into three different categories. You have governments, then you have private industry, and then you have civil society. Now, I find it interesting that the kind of work or cooperation that exists between civil society and governments, which is why we have, for example, think tanks and NGOs. That would probably be the best example of cooperation between governments and think tanks. Between government and civil society. Now, it's quite important because there's a lot to be gained from this in order to diffuse power, not have everything concentrated in the government. So to have this cooperation with these organizations from civil society. However, what one also has to recognize once you have this diffusion of power away from government towards civil society is someone can seek to harness that or hijack it, or, well, use what word you want, but to manipulate civil society. And we've seen that the United States has been quite successful at this in terms of developing think tanks, but also NGOs. So, for example, when you look at the color revolutions or the Arab Spring, different regime change taking place around the world, we always see it as a popular uprising. But what's quite interesting is the NGOs, which are facilitating all of this, they're always funded by the US government. And we can go deeper into that later on. But then on the other side, you also have think tanks, which are these, you can call them advisory organizations, or you have for forming expert opinion, which can help governments to develop the best possible policy. But my interest was how their power has grown so immensely over the past years or past decades, and also who's actually funding them, because they're funded by very special interest, primarily the weapons industry. And then I try to look at how does this influence the policies, given that they have so much control, especially in the US, in American politics.
So the question I want to ask is, and I'm looking at a list here now of more than 50 think tanks in the United States. Several of them are very well known. Others are not so well known, but I'm looking at the Rand Corporation, the Heritage Foundation, Brookings, Carnegie Endowment, the Cato Institute, and I could go on and on and on with this list. Now, who are these people? What makes them so-called experts to be employed because they're paid and paid very well in these think tanks? And people in the United States are going to be very familiar with the term think tank. We don't have to come up with a synonym. They basically know that. But who are these people? How do they get there?
Regarding your list, all of them are heavily funded by the weapons industries, with one exception. I'm not 100% sure about the Cato Institute, to be honest. I'm not saying they're not. I'm a bit uncertain, so I'm not sure if I would put them on the list without double checking it. But we always had through history, private governments seeking counsel or advice from civil society, from their own organizations. So the idea behind it is not bad, because usually as the world becomes more complex, that's when really think tanks began to emerge, because we elect these politicians, for example, in the US, into Congress. They're supposed to make all the best decisions. This is how democracy works. But have a look at the people we elect in. They're not geniuses. They are, they have limited capabilities. Even the smartest ones of them, they're not able to understand, have the in-depth understanding about the complexities of everything from, local economic policies, domestic, international economics, to have security from, Zimbabwe, Brazil, Indonesia, to have all the understanding of fiscal policy, trade relations. This is it becomes very, very complex. So as the world becomes more and more complex, we do need. It makes sense for politicians to seek some outside experts. And historically, we had some cooperation between government and academia, but academics often, we tend to be less interesting often, because it's a lot of discussion about theories and models, and often focusing on very narrow aspects. So what the think tanks come and offer is very specific policy advice, which is why many of them appeared after the First and Second World War, because they had very specific background and something to contribute with. Now, so I don't want to dismiss them out of hand, but the problem is, especially since the 1980s, they began to get more and more influence in many ways. They start to three main areas I would identify. The first is they end up writing the majority of all of these reports and analysis, which are then given to the politicians to make decisions. And they also give these testimonies in congressional hearings. So that's one where they indirectly impact them. But the second one is the actual people who they hire, because they have a tendency also to hire the actual politicians. So if you look at people, pretty much all of the Bush administration, for example, came from the Project for a New American Century, which greatly influenced the policy of invading Iraq. You had the same with Barack Obama, obviously, and his think tank, where most of his staff came from, the top staff. They were attributed by the New York Post, to have been able to make Obama change his mind regarding pulling out of Iraq, and also influence his policies in Afghanistan. And this goes on and on. So you have this hiring. You hire former government officials out of government. You give them these cushy jobs as fellows where they can stay relevant. And then once they're done, once they're able to get into government, they still remain fellows and working for these think tanks, or they're on a temporary break. But anyways, they still have that close affiliation. And then, so this is another way to gain influence over policy. And the third one would be media, because when the media wants expert opinions, we also see that the think tanks tend to dominate. They have their main experts coming out, and often they present themselves as being, we're objective, neutral, we're just working for this think tank, researching policy. So it's which would be all fine and well, but what one has to recognize then is an immense amount of power shifts from the policymakers who were elected to the people who they're getting advice from, and that's the think tanks. So the problem then is who are funding them, and this is the main problem, because this is a very open secret. This is the main criticism of the think tanks. This is that they have a business model in which they have to sell influence, because why would you invest millions and millions of dollars into think tanks? Well, you want something in return. And what do you get in return? Well, we can look at the ones who are financing it. Often, they get money from foreign governments to make sure that they have, good, that the think tanks are advising them to keep good relationships to these governments. So the Arab states, for example, they're quite active in funding the think tanks. But the dominant financier would be the military-industrial complex. They fund pretty much all of them, with a few exceptions, and it's vast amount of money. And so the problem we then have is you create a business model in which military solution or militarism becomes the go-to solution to all your problems. Again, it's no need to scream conspiracy theory. This is the business model, and this is it's been criticized also by many within the think tank community. Some who would like for think tanks to have its original purpose, which is to help form a good policy. So your question, sorry for going on, but your question about what makes them so special. Initially, what should have made them special was their expertise, but what makes them special now is to a large extent their willingness to repeat what they're told to say. So to follow the guidelines of whoever's financing them and push that policy. If you have the right connections and you're able to push for these policies, then yes, you have. I think that's what makes you special now. So I've compared it to hyper-capitalism, in which in hyper-capitalism every aspect of social life is run by the market. And the think tank industry, I would say, it signifies that even foreign policy is now outsourced to the market. When we create this pay-to-play scheme in which policies are determined by the highest bidder, which is always the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, well, the Cato Institute is funded by Charles Koch and some of his oligarch billionaire buddies. The National Endowment for Democracy, NED, is funded by the United States Congress itself. And then you have the Rand Report, or the Rand Corporation, that I think is directly funded by the military-industrial complex. In other words, the weapons manufacturers. It's really incredible that there are so many of them, extremely well-funded, by really rich, very rich individuals or collections of individuals. But as you mentioned, there's a massive amount of money coming from the military-industrial complex. It's incredible the influence that they do have now. And, you mentioned that these policy makers, implementers in the United States Congress, number one, they're not necessarily very bright people. Number two, they stay there and they remain there to remain in power and to become extremely wealthy. How do they do that? Well, they get money from a variety of sources, including some of these think tanks. Now, you mentioned NGOs earlier, and I want to shift the focus to non-governmental organizations. There have got to be, I don't know, hundreds maybe. And I know that Congress, through the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, gives grants, more than 2,000 a year, to NGOs around the world who are working, get a load of this, I want your comments, for democratic goals in more than 100 countries. Now, to me, that's a joke. To funding working for democratic goals around the world. Are these not the people, the very people who are on the ground, who are funding protest, funding color revolutions, and the like in these 100 or more countries around the world?
Yes. Okay. Can I just address one thing before I answer that? That is, you mentioned the Rand Corporation. I would just like to point out that this is the one, if I'm not mistaken, who gets the most money from the weapons industries. They began after World War II, largely being the intelligence agencies, who they hired in to make analysis, and we also see that they've had more or less a finger in planning a lot of the wars, for if not all the wars of the United States. And if most people have probably seen Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Again, it's a classic. If you haven't seen it, everyone should see it. Daniel Ellsberg, the one who leaked the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, he argued that this movie, Dr. Strangelove, is a satire based on Rand Corporation. However, in from his perspective, it was more of a documentary than a satire. That's in his words, because it was so close to reality how extreme the militarism becomes when everything needs a military solution, because that's the business you're in. And so I would advise everyone to also read the report, about 300 pages plus from Rand Report in 2019, which is Extending Russia. If you want to understand a bit about how one of the most influential think tanks have influenced US policy, you should read this report, because the whole report is about how you can weaken Russia and create as much problems as you can. So internally, of course, destabilize the country. They even refer to Navalny every now and then. In Ukraine, will create conflicts, threaten NATO expansion, try to pull the Russians more into Donbass to bleed them, both in terms of soldiers and money. And this was 2019, so this obviously has some impact on how the war began. Reduce Russian influence in Moldova, try to decouple Central Asia from Russia. Again, destabilize Russian borders. Also, the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict. As long as you can destabilize Russian borders, destabilize it internally, it will have more instability, and that will give America benefit. So, and all of this, of course, is written in the language of very cold strategic interest, weaken adversaries and destroy them. But when you see this filtrated into the media, it's all colored in the language of democracy and freedom and human rights. But obviously, this is not what the main policy is all about. So sorry, I just want to add that, since you mentioned Rand, because they're quite interesting. In regards to this NGOs, they're also quite interesting, because the National Endowment for Democracy, it was actually established in 1983. And would you guess who gave the inauguration speech for it? Because that's also quite interesting. Well, we can make
I
that.
don't know. Let me guess. George H.W. Bush?
No, that was Ronald Reagan. And
Reagan himself.
Yeah, the Reagan himself. And the main argument was that the CIA got caught all the time attempting to topple government, interfering in the democratic process, and this caused a lot of embarrassment. So you have this concept of hiding in plain sight. So why hide what we're doing? We can just do it in the open. Just call it democracy. And of course, this is problematic, because you're trying to now you're creating NGOs in order to harness or hijack the civil society of other countries. And of course, people can say, "Oh, but democracy is important." Yes, of course. But if you're an American, imagine if the Chinese or the Russians or any other countries who is not friendly to the United States would set up NGOs in order to organize civil society and mobilize them. Would they trust that a hostile government should organize their civil society? I mean, only a few months ago, you had Michael McFaul, which is the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, arguing that the main objective for Russia, for the United States and its partners in the years to come, is to sow divisions within Russian society to weaken Putin as much as possible. And this is the problem. If when you have democracy, by definition, it's a pluralism. And in a democracy, you want to have a pluralism of ideas, but you want to have order. You don't want to have chaos. Well, what would be the main objective for the United States to organize civil society in, for example, Russia? Would it be simply, "Oh, we just want democracy and freedom," or would you want to sow discord? Do you want to have divisions and weaken the country from within? Again, it's not a conspiracy theory, which is why Americans would never permit Russia from interfering in their civil society. Anyways, sorry, but just very, I always get sidetracked. Back to Reagan. He gave this speech when.
I want to stick with this.
Yeah.
National Endowment for Democracy, because I knew that the reason it was founded, and by the way, George H.W. Bush was Ronald Reagan's VP, former director of the CIA, and it was a cover for the CIA that was doing these undercover operations, influence around the world. So they just changed the name, they funded the heck out of it, and it's still, is it not, the CIA that's involved in all of these countries under the disguise of spreading freedom and democracy and funding NGOs? Is it not really still the CIA?
Yeah, it is. And this is also the irony, because we should have started by just specifying what the acronym stands for. NGOs is non-governmental organizations. However, the US government funds the National Endowment for Democracy as well as Freedom House, and it's often staffed with people with close ties to the US intelligence community. So former CIA directors, for example, Woosley, he was leading it in Ukraine. So it's it's a better cover. But you're also right. Alan Weinstein, who was a co-founder of the National Endowment for Democracy, he even was quoted as saying that what we're doing today was done covertly by the CIA previously. And you have and this was Reagan's argument as well. We should stand proudly in the spotlight where we belong. We should be proud of our message. We shouldn't hide anymore about what we're doing. So that's the main idea. Just do it in the open, and then there's nothing to hide. And if anyone criticizes your interference, well, you say that you just hate democracy. So it's a very sneaky way of doing things. But obviously the main objective is not to promote democracy. It's either to sow divisions in other countries or to remove governments. But this is also why it's an important component of propaganda, because people don't often misunderstand propaganda because it's used, in everything these days. But one of the reasons why most of the literature on propaganda recognizes that the United States was actually more effective in propaganda than, for example, the Soviet Union, was because the Soviets, they were, everything was a government, and you had the people in their government positions. They were just spewing out statement after statement, which we knew where it came from. What made the British and American more skilled at propaganda is they were laundering their propaganda through private institutions, because a key component of propaganda is source credibility. If you have two people, they might say the same thing. It can be immensely more credible if it comes from, for example, a trustworthy source. And this is why when people refer to RT, the Russian media company, as propaganda, I find it to be my counter argument is everyone knows who it is. It is funded by the Russian government. They would like the English-speaking world and the rest of the world also to have an understanding from the Russian perspective. You know where they're coming from. You know they're seeing the world through the eyes of Russia. This is not great propaganda. Great propaganda creates source credibility, and that's why NGOs are so good, because it's still the same people who run it as when it was the CIA, but it has more credibility because now it's not a intelligence agency in the shadows toppling governments. No, it's a democratic NGO. It's standing up for civil society, promoting liberal values. It has much more credibility, and I think that's why the NGOs have been so successful in all these color revolutions. They have the source credibility, and that's kind of half the job when you want to make excellent propaganda.
Well, you mentioned several areas in this part of the world, anyway, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The United States NGOs are in both countries, Georgia and Abkhazia, also involved in conflict, but the United States is very actively involved in both of those countries. You mentioned Moldova. We probably should also mention Belarus, that the United States tried to overthrow Lukashenko. It's obvious to many people, probably more so in this part of the world, what the United States is really doing and how they're doing it. And your description of propaganda was really very outstanding. Let's shift gears now. I want to come to this new book that will be coming out later this year. And the topic is closely related to what we're talking about, the think tank racket. The subtitle, Managing the Info War with Russia. Let's talk about that, Glenn, in the light of how these think tanks operate, and this book. Tell me about this book, and when is it going to come out?
Yeah, good question. I have to check with the publisher. I think it's supposed to come out in October, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's October. All the manuscript has been submitted, and all the editing has been done. So I don't think there should be any delays. It might even be August, but I have to look that up, to be honest. I lose a bit track sometimes. But it does focus on these think tanks, how they become largely an instrument and of influence in the United States. And obviously Russia has one of the reasons I also wanted to focus on Russia, besides me being a scholar who primarily works on Russia, is that Russia has always had a very central role for the military-industrial complex in the United States. Keep in mind, the U.S. didn't have this in the past. This was created because it faced the Soviet adversary after the Second World War, and you actually had President Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell speech, as most have probably heard or read, where he warns against this creeping influence of the military-industrial complex. And again, it's not. It often comes up in these conspiracy theories, but again, this was the president of the United States stepping down, and his main argument was simply that the military industry in the United States was getting so powerful that it forms a new center of power. Now, what many people don't know is that Dwight Eisenhower in his notes initially wanted to refer to it as the military-industrial congressional complex. So this was he wanted the Congress in there as well to point out how a huge military industry gains more political power. And but again, I think it was alienating probably more of the political class by criticizing the empowerment of this industry. So he took that out and just ended up with the military-industrial complex. But of course, this does mean that Russia's the only concern, especially around African countries. You find a lot of apprehensions, but not just think tanks, by the way, but also NGOs, in which they feel that part of their development of states means they have to have a more open society, more democracy. And again, this is what we claim that we want. But once the societies become more open, they become more vulnerable to external manipulation and interference. And that's to a large extent what these think tanks and all do. And also becoming a growing problem in the European Union, by the way, in which the think tanks are marching around, giving advice, and also throwing a lot of money around in Brussels to shape policies. So, but again, my main focus was Russia, simply because this huge military-industrial complex emerged during the Cold War, and when the Cold War was over, the military or the arms industry had a problem. Where will our income come now? And actually, if you look at the debate about expanding NATO, because now it seems as it's uncontroversial, everyone sees it as being not provoking at all. But in the 90s, you saw that this was very dominating or a leading idea, that expanding NATO would be a horrible mistake. Even Clinton said it in January of 94. If we expand NATO, we might redivide Europe again between East and West. And his defense minister, what is his name, William Perry, said that pretty much the whole administration recognized this would alienate Russia. But who cares? They're weak. That was the argument. But from going to being very much opposed to it to being for it, there was many variables influencing this. Obviously, you had lobbying by the Eastern European countries who wanted to be, maintain dividing lines, but also be on the right side of them. But it's also the military-industrial complex was quite interested, because they lost their whole business after the Cold War. But by expanding NATO, this was something in the 90s, New York Times, all of them wrote a lot about, was that would be a huge boom for their industries, because now you'd bring in all these new countries and they would have to get it aligned with the NATO standards. They would have to get rid of their Soviet weapons, buy American instead. So this was a huge business. So the economic incentive there meant let's throw away the peace we made with Russia and make some money. Of course, the think tanks weren't the only ones who were pushing in this direction, but that was one of the variables. So you can kind of track their think tanks' role in terms of shaping Russian policy, all the way until present time in the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I have taken exception to Saint Eisenhower, this great post-war president. He warned the country about the military-industrial congressional Congress. My friend Ray McGovern talks about that. Plus, he adds the media and academia in that complex. But Eisenhower was in power for 8 years and didn't do anything to stop it. I mean, I think that, a five-star general, hero of World War II in the Western world, he basically let it happen, in my opinion. But I don't want to linger on that. I want to go back to the information war with Russia. Now, I have been of the opinion, since I've been coming to Russia since 2016 and now living here for 3.5 years, I have said repeatedly that I think that Russia, and by the way, I've had several Russians agree with me, Russia is not even in the information war with the United States. Compared to what the United States is doing, if you look in terms of weapons or assets or so many different ways of conducting this information war, Russia is not even in the game. I'd like your thoughts on that. You may disagree with me, I don't know, but that's been my feeling.
No, I agree, and I think people don't recognize how powerful the information war or the propaganda has been, not just from the United States, but the West overall, because we talked about source credibility, but a key objective in propaganda is also to sell political sell political messages. So it's good to think about it as marketing, because in marketing you don't buy a car because you need transportation. It becomes a status symbol. When you sell a clothes, it's not just to stay warm. It's it's selling sex or sex symbols. So you have this is effectively why propaganda should be understood as the marketing of politics. And it shouldn't be any surprise that Edward Bernays, which was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, as an expert in group psychology, he looked at how this propaganda tends to work, and that's why he's the godfather of American propaganda. But he started off with a career in marketing, so promoting cigarettes to women. So how do you get women to smoke? Well, you promote it as freedom. So it's you call it torches of freedom. It was about emancipation of women. You link that ideal about emancipating women to the cigarettes. So of course there's nothing to do with it, but once you can do it, then it works. And then from there on, he went into politics, and then you have, for example, in Guatemala, they privatized, or no, they didn't privatize. They had a lot of this new worker laws coming out, and the United Fruit Company looked out to lose a lot of money. So he was marketing, how this country had changed. So the very much the capitalist president was portrayed as, or sold to the American people as, a communist, and at the end you could then intervene militarily and remove him. So this is how propaganda works, and this is largely the same formula that the West has used always against Russia. It's power politics, but it's sold as freedom and democracy. So this is it's always the same thing. We can look at Ukraine as well. Everything is about freedom, democracy versus authoritarianism. But behind the scenes, it's really nothing to do with democracy. I mean, we tried to pull the Ukrainians into NATO since 1991, pretty much, all the way to 2014. And during this time, only 20% of Ukrainians actually wanted to join NATO. But of course, if you follow the think tanks' reports and rhetoric and arguments, it's everyone has this clear image that the Ukrainians have just been trying to get out of the Russian shadow for years and years, and then finally 2014 came. We came along. We helped them with the democratic revolution. But again, all the facts show the contrary. So it's all about selling it. So did we try to pull in a Ukrainian population who didn't want to join NATO? And how it's sold? Well, we're just helping them to spread democracy, and see what happened since the coup. I mean, the Americans especially have been, cheering on, purging the Orthodox Church there, so killing off religion of freedom, purging the media. There's no more free media anymore in Ukraine. All of it's now under the control of Zelensky. All political opposition has been purged. The main opposition leader was arrested, so any freedom was eliminated in order to make Ukraine a frontline state. And again, this is horrible, what we've done to the country, and which also made Russia react in the way it did, which is terrible for Ukraine. But again, we're only selling that we're standing up for them. We're trying to help them, and when you have this powerful propaganda, it's the facts become quite pointless. They lose a lot of their value, because people only interpret the world through this lens. So whatever we talk about, not just Russia, but any international relations, we always talk about freedom versus authoritarianism. In the past, before World War II, during colonial days, it was more about civilization versus the barbarians. So you always have good versus evil, and as long as you can have this focus, it doesn't really matter what the facts are, because you always end up with the same. The facts don't matter. Let's say if we invade a country, well, before it was to spread civilization, now it's to spread democracy. If Russia invades someone, it's to expand an empire, it's to destroy freedom, it's to spread authoritarianism. So it's done for evil. When we do it, we do it for good. So in other words, the act of invading no longer matters, because it has to be interpreted through this filter, which is good versus evil, or main propaganda filter we have is everything is democracy versus authoritarianism, even though it's anything to do with democracy, which, by the way, this war also has nothing to do about democracy.
So I would like to know what your opinion is, why Russia has not been able to compete very well in this information war game. Why is that?
Yes, good question. I don't think they use with the source credibility. I don't see them infiltrating private institutions to the same extent, or even close by. Also, I don't see another key component. I also don't see this development of some kind of prism of how to interpret all events as being a kind of a struggle between good and evil. I don't see any of this at all. They have some of their own, but not to the same extent. But why? I'm not quite sure. It's a great question. I'm a bit. I have to think about this one.
Yeah. Well, I think during the Soviet era, the communist era, they did a pretty good job, I think, in the information war. They had a lot of countries believing in, the rights of the worker, in the sharing, the development of a more social environment in many countries, and they were feeling this very strongly. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and from my point of view, since that time, 1987 or so, perestroika and glasnost, and then we get into the Putin era, I think Russia didn't really even have a very strong ideological center or focus. I know some people have been critical about that. I think Kurganyan probably is one of the foremost that I'm familiar with that has said this is a problem for Russia. But anyway,
yeah, it's they have discussed this idea of a national idea or ideology, something to mobilize unity among the population. Usually, it's been reliant on a lot of conservative values, but in terms of functioning outside of Russian borders, I know Russia frames a lot as a struggle against hegemony, but this is a lot of how much of the world actually sees the struggle at the moment. But that's also part of the time we're living in with the decline of the U.S. empire. But I think also a part of the problem is why we might be a bit more disposed to this kind of propaganda in the West is we have different political objectives. We are pursuing global primacy or collective hegemony across the world. Quite open about it. Now the problem there is once you promote hegemony, you have to promote universal values, something that includes all, which kind of overrides sovereignty, something which gives you the right often to represent other peoples. So. Meanwhile, if you want a multipolar system, if this is the case, then you want to have focus on distinctive civilizational values. So this is ours, this is yours, because you want to prop up sovereignty. You don't want to give legitimacy to intervening in others' affairs. This has been a problem since. This has been an issue since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, because back then you had the Catholic Church who had represented universal values. They can elevate themselves above everyone to claim the right to sovereignty or representation of all of humanity. And then with the Reformation, it breaks down, and then thereafter you have more focus on distinctive values, distinctive culture, distinctive civilizations. So given that under Marxism or the Soviet era, when the Russians had both the capabilities and intentions of pursuing hegemony, I guess there are more tools and inclinations towards pursuing narratives and information wars and propaganda, which appeals to the common internationalist or some human freedoms, which is supposed to trump all sovereignty. But that could be one aspect, I guess.
Yeah, I have to give President Putin, more than anybody else on the planet right now, credit for promoting a multipolar world based on the strict observance of international law, the UN Charter, the fundamentals of the UN Charter, the sovereignty of all nations, diplomacy versus confrontation, and the idea that it's all about the development of all peoples and not a win-win and not a zero-sum game, but a win-win vision. I think this is very powerful, and I have to give Putin credit for that. I'm not sure that even a lot of my Russian friends really understand that yet and are involved in promoting that idea or even supporting it. But really, when I look at some 80 to 85% of the rest of the world, they are all wanting to leave the United States empire and are all talking now and working towards this multipolar world. They're all concerned about their own sovereignty. So I think this is ringing loud and clear with the rest of the world. And I would have to say that I think in that context, Russia and China also supporting this, along with the BRICS, the SCO, ASEAN, they're winning this information war with the rest of the world, and it's not really directed right at the United States. I find that really interesting, and I do have to give Putin at least credit for being, I think, the number one spokesperson and leader for that. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, I think China has also been hammering away kind of strong on this one. And again, it goes back to the same conflict. If you see the main tensions now being between, I know often, we portray it as being, someone trying to challenge, overtake the United States hegemony, but it's really the US pursuing unipolar world versus the rest, which are seeking multipolarity. Now, again, once you have, if you want multipolarity, then you have a balance of power. You have many centers of power. In such a system, you want sovereign equality. Each state to have equal sovereignty. And this is pretty much what the United Nations and international law is based on, sovereign equality. And but if you're a hegemon, if you want to dominate the world, which again is built into the US security strategy, then you're immediately in conflict. The unipolar moment is immediately in conflict with international law, because then it's sovereign equality. What you want to do is you want to have an ideology which facilitates hegemony. And that's why the United States has challenged international law with what it calls the rules-based international order. And as it always pointed out, what are the rules? Who's making them? And there are no specific rules, but the US are making them, and it's always to serve very specific immediate interests. And this is the problem, because what we're saying with the rules-based international order, what does it mean? Well, usually they say, well, it's international law plus humanitarian law, but what it really means is that liberal democratic values should be able to sometimes give exemption to international law. And who's the champion of liberal democracy? Well, the United States says, well, that's us. In other words, what you've done is you create a clause of exception in international law, but it's reserved only for the United States and its allies, because, of course, you can't have humanitarian interventions from China, Russia, because they don't have the same values as we do. That's the main argument. So every country has to abide by the UN Charter and international law, except for NATO countries under the US leadership, because we can interfere in other countries because we're promoting democracies with our NGOs. We can topple governments because it's democratic revolutions. We can invade countries through humanitarian interventions. So we can do all these things, but it's reserved for us, and that is the rules-based international order, which is not, you reject sovereign equality. You have sovereign inequality because we have the right to make others to deprive others of sovereignty if they don't follow our liberal values. But of course, if you look beneath the liberal values, is it consistent? No, of course not. If you look at the issue of territorial integrity versus self-determination, which was the issue in Kosovo, we said, no, well, we need self-determination. Kosovo should be able to secede from Serbia. Okay, well, then we come to Crimea. Well, no. Obviously, they want to secede as well. Every poll will show this. But no, here we have to prioritize territorial integrity of Ukraine. How about Taiwan? Well, secession as well. So and this is what propaganda is. If you're pretending that you're promoting liberal values, much like the NGOs, you're just promoting democracy, but you're only promoting those values in your opponent's countries or in specific incidents, then the common denominator is not democracy, it's a strategic interest. And if you're pursuing power interest and selling it as promoting values of human progress, that's propaganda. You are now taking one thing, which is power politics, you're dressing it up and selling it as democracy and freedom. That is the marketing of politics. This is propaganda, and this is what we do. And I think we get so lost in our own propaganda at times we don't realize what it is, because we've convinced ourselves propaganda is when you have Russian state TV disagreeing with us that this is propaganda. But we've redefined the concept.
Yeah, I participated in a webinar with people from Western and Eastern Europe. Maybe I think there were 8 or 10 of us, and I participated as the only expat American living in Russia. But all of them were talking about the United States' use of soft power in their countries. And we're talking about Germany, we're talking about Austria, we're talking about France, we're talking about Serbia, we're talking about, there was a woman on from Armenia, how the United States is directly influencing their politicians in a whole variety of ways. Also, the populations with these color revolutions that we're talking about. And so I think this soft power is what we've been talking about, has been extremely effective for the United States and still is. Its intent in this part of the world is to sow discord and chaos to create these issues for Russia. But Glenn, I want to ask you this before we finish. The United States hasn't just been using soft power. They've been using, and I don't know if we want to call it hard power, because many people would say, well, that's war. That's direct conflict. But the United States has over 100 military bases in 90 countries. Is that hard power or soft power? That's tremendous influence. That's occupation in many countries. And also, how do sanctions fit into this? Are sanctions soft power? It would appear to me that they're hard power, and they're really declarations of war. But I'd like your thoughts on this subject.
Well, I think it's good to think about it on a scale, because soft power usually refers to power usually means you're doing something. If you can make someone do something they would otherwise not have done, then you have power over them. Soft power is more cultural attraction or the ideals. So it's, again, very, very soft. You don't have to coerce anyone. They essentially making up almost their own mind to emulate. Military force obviously is the hardest form of power, and if you have a huge empire like the United States with the military stretching around, you can extract a lot of power in many ways. You can use it coercively to undermine other countries, but you can also use it for security dependence. Again, the United States, the main influence it has in Europe is that they largely finance European security. Now, this is during peacetime. They can't convert this really into a lot of political influence. But when you have war, such as now in Ukraine, and the Europeans feel very vulnerable, and they feel they're more reliant on this security from the United States, then the United States can really cash in. Now is the good times. They never been able really to convert this security dependence into economic loyalties. But now in Europe, we're doing, well, as Macron would say, we've become vassals. We've become very obedient because we need the security guarantees from the United States. So you can use military power in many different ways. The economic aspect is, I would also call it economic coercion if you use it in the form of sanctions. Of course, it doesn't have to be coercive. One of the things that annoys the Europeans is when you, for example, use the SWIFT payment system, which is American, or use the US dollar, you have to abide by US decisions. They have extraterritorial jurisdiction. So the US can put sanctions. For example, the Americans put sanctions on Iran after the US broke free of the nuclear agreement. And the Europeans wanted to follow the agreement, but the US can now punish the Europeans, because if they don't also break the agreement and follow American sanctions, then they can be, they can be fined. They can be fined. So the Americans have fined, French banks, energy companies, Brazil. They essentially putting unilateral sanctions and forcing the rest of the world to abide by it. The problem of sanctions, of course, is they work best when it's temporary and there's an absence of alternatives, which is why they were so effective during the unipolar era in the 1990s, because if you sanction someone, they have nowhere else to go. The problem now is you have a multipolar world. You have new centers of powers emerging, and also the US tends to goes after larger countries. It's now putting all these sanctions on Russia. It's threatening China. And also the sanctions against Russia are never ending. They become so ingrained that I can't imagine being able to remove them anymore. So in other words, countries they have to learn how to live without you. In a multipolar world, it's not so hard. So the Russians, for example, doing everything they can now to decouple from American industries, because access to them can be used as a weapon. Decouple from a SWIFT payment system, decouple from the US dollar. Be less dependent on the transportation corridors, that is the physical corridors which are controlled by the US Navy. So all of these things are happening, and it's not just the United States, because any country know that they could be next on the list, especially China, but also secondary sanctions, because we're also threatening friends and allies. We're threatening South Africa. Do you trade with Russia? We might sanction you too. How about India? Sanction you too. The Turkey. We go even after our own friends. So this is the main problem. And so now the whole world kind of woke up going, listen, why should we be dictated to by the United States? And Russia's shown you can make other arrangements now, circumventing the US dollar, and the Chinese are going with it. The Indians, the Turks, South Americans, everyone is on board. Nobody wants to be hostage to the US, and this is the main problem of. This is what I've been warning for many years, and people often mistake what I'm saying as being anti-American in some way. But my main argument is this pursuit of global hegemony. It's not in America's interest, because it's temporary by definition, or not definition, but it's a temporary phenomenon. Because over time, not only does the US exhaust its resources and compelling its physical resources, military, economic, but also it loses its legitimacy for empire, because the harder it has to go to keep rising centers of power down, the less legitimacy will have. So in the 1990s, everyone was celebrating America. The main foreign policy of China, Russia, was to get along as well as possible with the Americans. But now, of course, it's it's gone quite the other way. So the legitimacy for empire is gone. The money behind the empire is gone. The military power for empire is gone. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is seeking all these economic and military partnerships to balance the US. So Sorry for the long answer, but it's just I feel it's a very self-defeating, self-harm policies which are being pursued, and there's no ability because of all this think tank influence and propaganda to change it, because going down this path of destruction there is no acceptance for any more dissent away from this political path.
Yeah, and I would just add a couple of things to that. I don't recognize the United States of America, my country, anymore. In addition to what you've just been describing, the social fabric of the United States is being torn apart. The government is obviously corrupt. They're not representing the will of the people, and Congress's approval factor is in single digits. They don't trust the president. They don't trust the courts. And so you see not only this political discord, but social discord. You see all these issues about immigration, divisions between religions, personalities in politics versus issues and substance. And what I see is, I think what you're talking about, the same kind of thing that happened to the Roman Empire and all subsequent empires. They overextended, there was corruption, and they lost their really moral integrity. Glenn, I want to thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion. It's always a pleasure to have you. I look forward to having you back again very soon.